This week we visit the world of pastoral Israel, a realm of peace and natural pleasures enjoyed by a privileged few in 18th century France and Britain. Two dramatic explosions were to sweep this world away, the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. And of course, painting would change along with everything else. But we can revisit this lost world of aristocratic ease because it is preserved in French painting and in British, the first time our art reaches major status. The British contribution to the story happened just when the new squirearchy was finding its feet. Country gentlemen needed paintings to show off their status, to show their impossibly elegant selves and their possessions. If you were proud of your wife, send for Joshua Reynolds, first president of the brand new Royal Academy of Art. Or if your prize bloodstock mare was the apple of your eye, then who better than George Stubbs? Stubbs was far more interested in the beauty of horses than in the vanity of his human patrons. But all these paintings immortalized a quintessential Englishness. And beyond the houses, gardens and paddocks lay that special joy, the countryside. What could be more English? The landed gentry drew their wealth from it, and it's always fascinated our painters, and none more than Thomas Gainsborough. This is one of the great comic masterpieces. I don't want to accuse Gainsborough of being a manipulator, but here he got to do exactly what he wanted, which was to paint landscape and not concentrate on portraits. And he did this by cunningly persuading young Mr. and Mrs. Andrews that for their wedding picture, they really wanted it painted out of doors to show people the extent of their property. So he gets to paint the great golden sweep of Suffolk. And overhead, a summer sky with darkening clouds. And here he's really being very naughty, because if ever a marriage suggested darkening clouds, storms ahead, this one did. He's really looked at these two. He's seen that Robert has gone out shooting with his silk stockings, notice all wrinkled at the ankle, and his silk coat and his fancy hat, and he still looks so uninteresting as a person. His clothes don't cohere. He's a yobbo. He'll make anything look shabby. And he's got that great, thick, unintelligent face. I'm so glad that Gainsborough painted the dog, who clearly loves him, because one does feel he's not going to get a lot of love from Frances Mary. That thin, tense, scraggy little figure with her nasty little pointed shoes sitting there on that ludicrously elaborate garden bench, staring suspiciously out at us. It's not a marriage made in heaven. And I feel definitely Gainsborough is being naughty when he paints right here in the front the corn sheaves of fertility. Because can you imagine these two talking to one another, let alone going further? And yet one's interested. And that's always the mark of a great portrait. British art had found a voice at last. In France, the voice was far more sophisticated, a soft and lilting voice, singing of wit and aristocratic pleasure and the enchantments of love. It wouldn't last, but what delight it gave and gives. French aristocrats were, of course, quite unlike the British. They delighted in fantasy, sensuality, pleasure. Even the name for this era, the Rococo, is playful and unreal. This was the world of let them eat cake, when the Queen dressed as a shepherdess, impossibly beautiful people who cocooned themselves in an impossibly beautiful world. The picture that sums up this fleeting, unreal life is Watteau's painting of couples visiting Cythera, the island of love. And at first, it looks like the essence of light-hearted Rococo. But look again. They are leaving the island. It's Watteau's sadness. He's saying that love doesn't last. They're leaving this magical world to go back to the real world, where they will separate. So what could be sadder than the thought that you may come to the island of love, but that inevitably you've got to leave it? If love didn't last, neither could the world of the French king and his court. One Rococo artist, more serious-minded than the rest, saw this. Now what we're looking at is a young child absolutely absorbed in building a house of cards. But at another level, because this is a very great painter, Chardin, he's asking us to think, what are we absorbed in? Are all our occupations a house of cards? Because a house of cards was a well-known emblem for wasting time. And we can go deeper yet, because this was painted in the 18th century. And before the century was over, the great tottering edifice of the French court and the French monarchy and the French aristocracy would be swept away like a house of cards, king and all. The French masses rose up, the terror began. The nobility were rounded up, stripped of the trappings of wealth, crammed into prison cells, a sham trial, off with their heads. The revolution had its official artist, David. He brought revolutionary zeal into art. The hand that held the paintbrush also signed hundreds of arrest warrants. David was probably the most influential artist of the century, but that doesn't mean he was a great humanitarian. He was wildly enthusiastic about the revolution. No voice was louder than his in voting for the execution of the king and queen. And it was from this prison that poor Queen Marie Antoinette, like so many others, went to the guillotine. David made a cruel sketch of her on her way to her execution. His most famous painting is also about a scene of death, the assassination of the man who declared liberty must be established through violence, Jean-Paul Marat. If you can imagine a party political broadcast that is also a major work of literature, then here is its visual equivalent, David's Death of Marat. This was an event that had rocked contemporary France. The great politician, the great sender of people to the guillotine, Marat, had been assassinated by a young French girl, Charlotte Corday, who thought the best thing she could do for her country was to rid them of this monster. But of course, to David, he's not a monster at all. He's a hero. And he does all he can to show us the pathos of a great statesman cut down in his prime. Now, it's a rather dubious prime because poor Marat had a loathsome skin condition, which meant he had to spend most of his time in a bath of lotion. He was also ferociously ugly, but David does the best he can with that to make his face look interesting. He doesn't miss a trick, does David? The sheet with its darn, and this makeshift table. The pen that has dropped from the lifeless hand. It had probably been writing death sentences, but what David shows it is writing letters for the poor. This is a great man sacrificed. In fact, it's exactly like the picture of a saint, which to Marat, I think, was how he felt himself to be, and to David was how he really was. Remember, David was this kind of man too. A man fanatic for the good of the people, and it didn't matter how many people were killed in doing it. So it's painted not with political slyness, it's painted with great compassion for Marat, a great indignation that this hero should have been killed. Like all great propagandists, David kept his message simple. He believed that only the simplicity of the classical world was suitable for the new society. He passed his mantle on to a pupil, and French classic art had a new high priest. I've a real weakness for Ingres, the great classical painter. And here in his Bather of Valpenson, you can see what classical painting can be. It's classical painting at its most elegant and powerful. The clarity of line, the wonderful sense that almost this could be a sculpture, there in its stillness before us. Now, this could be dull. Classical art sometimes can be. To make it exciting, it needs to be infused with passion. And that's exactly what we get here with Ingres. Because he had a passion for, wait for it, the female back. He was obsessed by it. I won't go into psychology, which I don't understand, but somehow everything about the female back was fulfilling to him. And what he's painting here is not really the bather. She doesn't interest him, but the back. And light plays upon this whole beautiful body, from the long neck right down to the cleave of the buttocks, as though he sort of licked his paint adoringly over every part of her. And to me, it's a wonderful paradox that this great classic painter, the virtuous Ingres, should be the one painter who so celebrates the beauty of the human body. While France was still reeling from the bloodbath of the Revolution, rural Britain stuck to its traditional course. This idyllic world, too, was doomed, but it was captured just in time by Britain's best-loved painter, Constable. He was a miller's son, brought up here at Flatford. And the thing about him is that he could only paint what he loved, and what he'd loved for a long time. It was the countryside of home, the unexciting fields and streams where he'd lived as a youth, that drew from him those magically simple and yet complicated landscapes. And here's where he painted his best loved work, the hay wain. For so many people, this is their favorite painting. And I think if you were to ask them why, they might say that this reminds them of what we've lost, the innocent countryside, when the waters were crystal clear and there was only the sound of dogs and birds and that great drowsy peace lying over everything. It's gone, and we long for it. And strangely enough, Constable felt the same in a different way. When he painted this, he was a married man living in London with heavy responsibilities. He hadn't changed in his love. The country hadn't changed in its beauty, but he changed from being a carefree boy to being a man. And again, he felt tears coming to his eyes when he looked at the familiar, beloved land and knew in one sense he'd lost the secure happiness of his boyhood there. But I think it's more than just a longing for what's lost. Because remember, he loved this in the strictest sense. He felt a passion for this country. And whenever there's a passion, there's a sort of erotic charge, there's a thrill to it. And you feel that here, that deep, passionate love. Forever, that hay wain will move empty into that glorious heavenly meadow where the hay will always be waiting to fill the wagon. So there's emptiness and there's completion. There's longing and a sense that if you love something deeply enough, it's never lost. But the Industrial Revolution, with its machinery and steam and power, was changing the face of England. One artist loved the new forces, Turner. For Turner, the new age was one of progress, to be romanticized in a blaze of light. The Fighting Temeraire is one of those splendid, luminous, extravagant, romantic, technicolor, over-the-top paintings that came so natural to Turner. And because they came naturally, they're completely convincing. He was a born romantic. And of course, here he has one of the great romantic themes. The Temeraire had been one of Nelson's ships, one of the heroes of Trafalgar. And now the glory days are over. It's not wanted. And it's being towed away to be broken up. And of course, there's the great yellow and gold and red glory of the sky as the sun sinks like a Viking's funeral pyre. Yes, but notice there's another red and gold glory in the picture, and it's coming from the tug, that shapely, bustling little tug. Because although there's all the romance of the past in the Temeraire, the days of fighting and heroism in warfare, there's romance in the tug. The romance of science, of mercantile adventure. It's the latest thing in British technology. And Turner is one of the great affirmers of life. He doesn't know how to lament. He loves the past, but he also loves the present. And his brave, clever little tug bustles with immense confidence into the future. Turner belonged to the Romantic movement that was sweeping across Europe like wildfire. The Romantics celebrated the elemental forces of nature. The wilder, the better. And if nature was out of control, so were emotions. The drama of Delacroix's paintings spills over into violence and sadism. Life was to be lived on the edge, or beyond. And in his quest for the extreme, Géricault visited a madhouse, painting a woman with gambling mania, her red-rimmed eyes unable to see beyond imaginary games of chance. Géricault embodied the romantic ideal. He lived with the intensity of a comet and burnt out as quickly, dying young after falling from one of the horses he so loved to paint. In Spain, the atrocities of Napoleon's invasion were witnessed by the greatest romantic of the age. Goya's understanding of human suffering makes his vision the most profound of any romantic. He came from a poor family and clawed his way up through the court system to become painter to the doomed Spanish royal family. Here is Goya, facing the chief professional challenge of a court painter, painting a very unprepossessing royal family. There's Carlos IV with his poppy eyes and his red, unintelligent face, and his queen, Maria Luisa, who really was the best mind of the lot. Her mind was practically subnormal, so proud of herself, showing herself off. And somehow, he's got to be truthful and show this dull, unintelligent family as they really are, and yet he mustn't alienate them. Now, he gets the truth. How does he avoid the alienation? He paints on the most gorgeous clothes. There never has been anything more seductive, more glittering, more gleaming than those gauzes, those satins, those silks, those velvets, those diamonds. They look so beautiful, almost, you might say, from the neck down. And because they were very unintelligent people, and they knew quite well what their faces were like, and probably thought they were very handsome people, they loved this painting. None of them saw that it, as it were, both showed them up for the dullards that they were, as well as showing them for a splendidly, dramatically dressed group of people. Now, because he's Goya, he's got to show us something else. And he surrounds them with pools of shadow in which they huddle together, pathetic, a sad little group of people, very ill-equipped to deal with life. Goya always saw deep into the human soul. Increasingly, what he saw there was dark. Old, deaf, and ill, he retreated into himself and made what are called his black paintings. They're in a museum now, but in fact he painted them with fierce strokes on the walls of his home, in his reception room, his dining room. He lived with them. You can see from the jewel with cudgels that the black paintings aren't necessarily black in colour, but they come from a blackness of the spirit. These two men are determined to beat one another to death with their bludgeons. And it's so senseless. They're sinking in the quicksands. They could save one another. And I think that's the thing that Goya feared above all. Human stupidity, especially stupidity armed, because there's nothing you can do about it. You can't appeal to them. And in that beautiful land, they seem to be poisoning it, infecting it. The clouds are darkening. And that little hill over there has sinister red streaks, rather like the blood flowing down one man's face. And that green at the bottom looks like something unclean, pus-like. And I think even beyond the fear of human stupidity, there was something that haunted Goya. It's very clear in this sad little picture of the dog. He's either buried in sand or he's looking over a ridge, and he's absolutely terrified. Every movement of that imprisoned head speaks of fear. He's in a glory of light, and that glory is beginning to thicken, to curdle, to assume some strange, mysterious, inexplicable shape that is menacing. And I think that's what Goya felt, that there's no way to hide. We're held there. There's no escape. Even light can become a threat, can become darkness. Oh, and I hope so much that painting these dark works exorcised his imagination, distanced him from them. What I can't bear to think is that they only confirmed him in his despair. From the darkness of Goya, we must move next to fashionable Paris and the sunlit world of the Impressionists.